clammy ceiling fan hovered, dripping honey-like substance onto Martha Thomas's pale hands. The drops fell with a slow, sticky phantom plink, 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 each one leaving a cold, translucent smear on her skin. She traced the worn keys of her silent piano, ignoring the jar of teeth beneath her sink. The porcelain felt unnaturally smooth, like river stones worn by time, but the cold seeped through her fingers. The air tasted of wet rust and something older, a metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat. She'd heard the teeth jar rattle when the wind hit the broken window pane, a sound like dry bones shifting. Now, the fan's drip solidified into a single human tooth embedded in the sink's porcelain. It wasn't a drop anymore. It was a fiffing quine. The train whistle began again. Not the distant, familiar sound of the old line, but a deeper, colder note that seemed to vibrate inside her skull. It descended in pitch, a slow, mournful fun hui, uhum, that never grew closer, only deeper into the hollow of her chest. She pressed her palm flat against the piano's cool wood, feeling the faint vibration of the building itself. The silence between the whistle's notes was thick, a physical weight pressing against her ears, heavier than the cold air. She could almost taste the frost on the window glass, the way it etched sharp lines onto the pane. The air felt thick with the scent of decay, but it wasn't rot. It was the smell of old snow, of stone left too long in the dark. Her fingers, still tracing the piano keys, brushed the sink's edge. The tooth now embedded felt unnaturally cold, a sharp point pressing against her skin. It wasn't just deforting the porcelain, it was sorting part of it, as if the porcelain had grown around it. The fan's drip had stopped, leaving only the ghost of its rhythm in the hollow of her palm. The train whistle's descent slowed, its frequency sinking lower, a sound that felt like it was pulling the cold from her very bones. She felt the freezing wind in the room with no windows, a current of ice that traced the line of her jaw, the back of her neck. The air tasted of wet rust and something older, the same taste as the teeth jar beneath her sink. The whistle's pitch sank into the silence, a single deep note hanging like a question. Martha's fingers froze. The tooth, embedded in the porcelain, pulsed with a cold that wasn't just physical. It was a cold that felt like it had been there all along, waiting. The sound of the train whistle's final descending note faded, leaving only the sharp, silent point of the tooth pressing into her palm. It didn't hurt. It felt like the only thing that had ever been real. The jar's lid was a thin, brittle thing, like the shell of a long-dead insect. I unscrewed it with a twist that felt like turning a key in a locked door. Inside, the teeth were arranged in a spiral, each one a pale, translucent shard of something that had once been human. I picked one up with my fingertips, the surface cool and slick, like the inside of a clam. It felt heavier than it should have, a weight that pressed into the palm of my hand. I placed it on the puzzle box, aligning it with the jagged edges of the fragments. The box was cold, its surface a smooth, unbroken plane of polished wood. I pressed the tooth into the gap, the fit perfect as if it had been meant for this moment. A wind entered the room, though there were no windows, no doors. It was a wind that felt like the breath of a thing that had been buried for centuries, a cold that seeped into my bones before I could react. It came from the box, a whisper of air that curled around my fingers, brushing against the back of my hand like a living thing. I pressed harder, my palm flat against the box's surface. The tooth, now aligned, felt like a key in a lock that had been waiting for me. The box shuddered, a low, resonant vibration that filled the room like a sound I could feel in my molars. The wind grew louder, a howling current that pressed against my ears, not with noise but with pressure, a force that made my skull ache. The box screamed, not a sound I could hear, but a sound I could feel, a vibration that tore through my chest, my throat, my teeth. It was a sound that had no shape, no direction, only a frequency that burned through my nerves. I fell to my knees, my hands pressing against the floor as the box trembled beneath me. The wind howled louder, a sound that was not a sound but a presence that filled the room, that pressed against my skin, my lungs, my thoughts. The box screamed again, and this time I felt it in my bones, in the marrow of my teeth, in the hollow of my chest. The scream shattered the box. The fragments flew apart, scattering in a spray of wood and light. I looked up, my eyes wide, my breath shallow. In the center of the room where the box had been, there was a mirror, not a mirror I had ever seen, but a mirror that reflected me, not as I was, but as I had been. My face was younger, my eyes brighter, my skin unmarked by time. I reached out, my fingers trembling. The mirror did not shatter, but it did not reflect the room behind me. It reflected something else, something that had been lost, something I had forgotten. The wind howled again, a sound that was not a sound, and I reached for the mirror, my reflection staring back at me, unblinking, unflinching. The cat was a small, twitching thing, its body curled like a comma on the floor. It had bitten the puzzle fragment, its tiny fangs pressing into the wood like a secret being unearthed. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and picked it up. The moment I touched it, I felt the cat's death, not in a sound or a scream, but in a cold that pressed into my chest like a weight I had carried for years. It was not a death I had expected, not one I had prepared for, and it was not a death that should have been mine to bear. The fur of the cat began to peel, not in a slow, deliberate way, but in a sudden, violent unraveling. It came off in strips, like wet paper being pulled from a wall, and each strip was a color I had never seen before. A shade of gray that was not gray, a white that was not white. It was a color that had no name, and it was a color that clung to my skin like a memory I could not forget. The cat's meow was a sound that did not belong to this world, a dissonance that curled around my ear like a noose. It was a sound that was not a sound, but a presence that pressed against my thoughts, a presence that whispered of regret, of a life-altering mistake that I had made and could never undo. I could feel it in my bones, in the marrow of my teeth, in the hollow of my chest. It was a sound that was not a sound, but a thing that had been buried for centuries, and now it was rising again. The fur peeled away, and with it came something else, something I had not expected. It was not a scream, not a sound, but a sensation, a feeling that pressed against my skin like 1,000 tiny needles. I could feel the cat's death, not as a loss, but as a betrayal. A thing that had been done to me not by the cat, but by something else, something that had been waiting for me in the silence between the notes of a piano. And then, as the last strip of fur peeled away, the fur began to form into something else, something that was not fur but teeth. They formed in my mouth, not as a sound, but as a presence that filled my mouth, my throat, my chest. They were not teeth I had ever seen before, but teeth that had been waiting for me, waiting for the moment when I would finally understand. I pressed the keys, my fingers finding the discordant scale that had haunted me since the first note of the puzzle box had screamed into the void. The train whistle stops, not with a suddenness, but with a slow, suffocating collapse, as if the air itself had been holding its breath. The room is a vacuum now, a hollow thing that swallows the sound and leaves only the cold. My breath fogs before it can escape my lips, and the temperature drops so quickly, it feels like the air has been cut from the world entirely. The floor beneath me is a sheet of ice, and I can feel it through the soles of my boots, the cold seeping into my bones like a slow, inevitable betrayal. The piano keys are not just cold. They are sharp, each one a blade that cuts into my fingers as I press them. I feel them embed into my teeth, not with a violence, but with a precision that is almost clinical, as if some unseen hand is guiding them into place. I open my mouth, and I can taste the metal of the keys, the bitter tang of something that is not just metal but something older, something that has been waiting in the silence between the notes of a piano. The sound of the train whistle is gone, but I can still hear it, not as a sound, but as a presence that lingers in the air like a ghost, a thing that was never meant to be silenced. The room is a tomb now, and I am the only thing that remains inside it. The mole's teeth are bared in the dark, jagged and uneven, where the frost has split the concrete. My boots sink into something soft and yielding, not snow, but the crushed husks of old holiday displays, the synthetic fur of fake reindeer still clinging to their plastic antlers. The puzzle box is a weight in my arms, its edges biting into my palms like the serrated spine of a book. I drag it across the broken tiles, the sound a slow, dragging fun scritch that echoes just once before the mole swallows it. The fountain sits ahead, its basin a mirror of black glass, its surface sealed beneath a crust of ice that groans under the weight of my gaze. I set the box down. The moment it touches the frozen water, the icy sings not a sound, but a vibration that hums in my bones, a low, resonant frinthrum that makes my teeth ache. The cold isn't just in the air. It's in the feuille boxy too, seeping from its seams like a slow bleed. I press my ear to its surface. Nothing. No whisper, no scream. Just the faint, rhythmic drippy of something melting beneath the ice. I exhale. The mist curls from my lips, but it doesn't disperse. It hangs there, suspended, a ghost of breath that refuses to fade. The mole's fluorescent tubes flicker once, twice, then die. The dark isn't just absence. It's a thing that impresses in thick and wet, like the inside of a sealed jar. I can feel the weight of it, the way it clings to my skin. I begin to sing. The notes don't come from my throat. They come from the box. The box twin sings back, and the sound is a knife dragging across glass, a shred of something ancient and hungry. The ice cracks. Not from warmth, from sudri. A spiderweb of fractures spreads across the surface, each line black as a vein, The water beneath is not water, it's oil. Thick, viscous, the color of old bruises, the crack widens. A hand breaks through. Not a hand, a claw, sharp as a scalpel, curved like the edge of a blade. It glistens with something dark and sticky. The ice gives way in sheets, and the claw drags itself free, leaving behind a trail of frost that hisses where it touches the air. It's not moving, it's what's waiting by. The box is singing now, a discordant scale played in reverse, each note a jagged edge that cuts at my ribs. I can taste the metal of it, the copper tang of old blood, the bitter afterbirth of something that was never meant to be born. The claw twitches, a single deliberate flick-eye of its wrist, and the final fragment of the puzzle box, small as a coin, smooth as bone, floats up from the oil below. I reach for it. The moment my fingers brush the surface, the claw strikes not at me. At the box, the tip of its nail sinks into the wood, and the final note of the scale explodes. The sound isn't in the air, it's in my skull. A hammer against bone, a crack that splits my mind in two. The mold dissolves. The ice, the fountain, the claw, all of it, unravels it into static, a snowstorm of white noise that burns my eyes. The last thing I see is the claw, now buried to the wrist in the box, its fingers twitching like a drowning man's then. The box, siphon screams. The claw retracted, leaving the oil slick shimmering faintly under the static gray of the ice. It didn't vanish, though. It remained, a dark stain blooming outwards, reflecting the distorted, fractured image of the mole's skeletal architecture. The scream, still echoing in the space behind my eyes, began to unravel, its jagged edges softening, morphing. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a vibration, a tremor deep within my bones, a pressure. The fragment of the puzzle box, no larger than a thumbnail, hovered in the air, suspended as if by an invisible thread. It felt familiar, too familiar. I reached for it, the metallic taste of the scream still coating my tongue. It tasted like dust and regret, like the faint, lingering scent of something I couldn't quite place. Something buried deep in the recesses of a memory I didn't know I possessed. My fingers closed around it. The surface was cold, smooth, unsettlingly organic. It wasn't wood. It was something else. Something that felt like a promise and a threat all at once. The vibration intensified. It wasn't coming from the box anymore. It was coming from fundy me, a rhythmic pulse, slow and deliberate, building in my chest. The world tilted, the static gray of the fountain blurring at the edges. I felt a compulsion, an undeniable urge, a voice not my own whispering in the back of my mind, chew. The act was almost involuntary. My teeth closed around the fragment. The taste was immediate, fitty bitter, earthy like crushed stone, and something sweet, something sickeningly sweet. It dissolved on my tongue, a grainy residue clinging to the roof of my mouth. The vibration became a throbbing. My heartbeat. But it wasn't my heartbeat. It was amplified, distorted, a monstrous parody of a human rhythm. The mole, the fountain, the claw, the box. All of it began to recede, to fold in on itself like a collapsing star. The static gray bled into a blinding white. A high-pitched whine filled my ears, rising in intensity until it felt like my skull would shatter. A train whistle, distant, mournful. It wasn't a sound I recognized yet. It resonated with a profound sadness, a longing for a place I'd never been. It grew louder, closer, swallowing everything. The white intensified, pressing against my eyelids, burning into my consciousness. I stumbled, the frozen ground slick beneath my boots. I reached out, grasping for something solid. But there was nothing. Only the relentless, accelerating pulse in my chest. The train whistle peaked, then abruptly cut off, leaving behind a silence that wasn't silent at all. It was a void, a hollowness that threatened to consume me entirely. The scream, it returned. Not as a sound, but as a sensation. A deep, resonant hum vibrating in my bones, growing stronger with each pulse. It was no longer an external force. It was internal. It 20 became my heartbeat. I pressed my fingers against the piano's keys, the scream still humming in my bones, a resonance that no longer felt foreign. The mole had transformed. It was no longer a skeletal ruin, but a hollow cathedral, its walls pulsing with a static gray light that seeped from every surface like ink bleeding through paper. It was not light, not really. It was something heavier, something that pressed against my skin and made me feel like I was being slowly folded into a shape I did not recognize. The air tasted of wet rust and something older, something that made my throat tighten with the memory of a mistake I had never made, but somehow knew. The piano strings vibrated in response to the scream, each note a jagged shard of sound that carved into the silence. I played not because I knew how, but because the scream demanded it. It was a language I had forgotten, a rhythm that had once been mine. The static grey light thickened, coagulating into something solid, something that began to drippy from the ceiling in slow, deliberate drops. It fell like honey, thick and viscous, but when it struck the floor it did not pool. It hardened, forming jagged, translucent shards that gleamed with an unnatural sheen. I stepped back, my breath shallow, my fingers trembling. The sound of the dripping was not a sound I recognized. It was a wet, gurgling fissquelcher, like a tongue scraping the inside of a skull. I turned, my blind eyes searching for something I could not name. The cat was there, no larger than a thumbnail, curled in the crook of my elbow like a parasite. It did not blink. It did not move. It simply stared, its tiny body rigid, its presence a weight in my mind. The scream pulsed again, louder now, a vibration that rattled the bones in my ears. The static grey light continued to drip, each drop solidifying into something tempered other. Something that tempered looked like teeth. They were not human teeth. They were jagged, uneven, with edges that caught the light and refracted it into something that felt like a lie. I watched as they formed, one by one, each one clicking into place with a sound like a door closing in a vacuum. The cat's eyes, tiny black pinpricks, began to change. They were not eyes anymore. They were swan teeth, forming in the same way the light had, each one clicking into place with a sound like a door closing in a vacuum. I could not look away. I could not breathe. The scream was no longer a sound, it was a forepresencer, a thing that twenty to the air around me, leaving only the taste of copper and the sound of wet parchment tearing. The cat's eyes, now fully formed, locked onto mine. They were not eyes. They were suk teeth, and they were sufi looking at me. The scream pulsed again, and the cat's eyes began to form the teeth. My fingers found the keys again, not out of choice, but because my body remembered before my mind could stop it. The song was wrong, backwards, warped, like a reflection in fractured ice. I hummed it first, a broken lullaby I'd sung to a version of myself who still believed in mistakes being fixable. My breath fogged in the air, though there was no cold here, only the weight of something pressing against my ribs like a forgotten scar. The mole's walls groaned, a sound like timber splitting under glacier pressure, but not from cold. From harmony. The cracks ran in perfect lines following the contours of the notes I played, the static grey light seeping through like oil in water, pooling in the fractures until the entire structure looked like a shattered pane of glass frozen mid-fall. The train whistle wailed again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was subordincy devemi, a rasp of exhaled breath against my eardrums, the voice of something that had once been a child's imagination, now a parasite humming in the hollow of my skull. "You remember now," it whispered, not through words but through the few sound end of my own voice, distorted as if spoken through a mouthful of broken glass. The cat's tiny body twitched in my elbow, its claws digging in like needles. I didn't feel the pain. I felt the idea of pain, the way a memory tastes when you realize it's yours but not yours at the same time. I sang louder. The song wasn't mine. It was the shape of a regret I'd carried like a second shadow. The mole trembled, the cracks widening, the light hardening into teeth along the seams, clicking together in a rhythm that matched my pulse. The cat's fur stood on end, not from fear but from thin recognition. It knew. It had always known. The static grey light dripped faster now, not as honey but as something thicker, something that twin-stretched when it fell, like taffy pulled too thin before snapping. The sound was a wet twin popper, the kind of noise bones make when they bend in the wrong direction. The train whistle screamed. My throat burned. The cat's claws retracted, its paw, no, its seven hand, pressing flat against my collarbone, not pushing but fervent holding, fingers splayed like the roots of a dead tree. I could feel the pressure of its palm, the texture of its skin, not fur but something footy older, something that had been peeled back layer by layer until only the memory of skin remained. The song in my throat became a sob, a question without words. Why does it hurt so much to undo what was never mine to begin with? The cat's hand slid up, the mole's teeth twacked together in unison, the light thickened. And then its palm was against my throat, not choking but sealing, pressing down with the weight of a promise I'd made before I was born. The last thing I heard was the train whistle, now a sigh, now a laugh, now the sound of my own breath stopping, and the cat's fingers curled around my windpipe. The box was cold in my hands, not from the air but from something inside it, something that had been buried for centuries and still remembered the weight of the earth. I traced the grooves of its surface with my fingertips, the wood worn smooth by the hands of people who had come before me, people who had opened it and never closed it again. The cat lay curled on the floor, its tiny body still, its breath shallow, like a moth caught in a spider's web, I didn't move. I didn't want to. I waited for the sound of the train whistle, but it didn't come. Instead, the box hummed, a low, wet vibration that pressed against my palm like a heartbeat. I slid the first panel open with a click that echoed in my skull, the sound of a jawbone snapping shut. The second panel followed, then the third, each one slower than the last, as if the box itself was resisting. The cat's body twitched, its claws digging into the floor, the sound of its nails scraping like the rasp of a blade against stone. I didn't look at it. I couldn't. I had to focus on the box, on the way it seemed to breathe, the way the air inside it was thick with something I couldn't name. It was not dust. It was not time. It was something else, something that had been waiting for me to open it. The final panel clicked into place with a sound like a scream being choked down. I reached inside, my fingers brushing against the cold, brittle edges of something that should not have existed. I pulled it out, and it was not a key or a trinket or anything that could be held in my hand. It was a scream, frozen in time, its edges sharp enough to cut through flesh. I pressed it into my palm, and the box shuddered, the wood splitting along the seams like a wound being torn open. The scream dissolved into something else, something that had been waiting for this moment, for the box to be opened, for me to hold it. It was not a sound, it was a presence, a weight, a pressure that pressed against my ribs, my lungs, my very being. The cat's body convulsed, its tiny fingers curling and uncurling, the sound of its breath growing louder, then quieter, then louder again. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe. The box shattered into snow, the shards of wood falling like ash, like the remains of something that had once been whole, but was now nothing more than fragments of a memory. The snow was not cold. It was not warm. It was something else, something that had no name, no shape, no color. It was static, gray and white, and it filled the room, the air, the space between my fingers, the space between my thoughts. The cat's body lay still, its eyes wide, its mouth open, its breath gone. I didn't feel the snow. I didn't feel anything. I only heard the train whistle, now a whisper, now a sigh, now the sound of my own breath stopping. I chewed the final fragment. It's not toothpaste, not bone, but the cold bite of a glacier underfoot. The mall's fluorescent lights flicker once, then die, leaving only the static gray snow falling from nowhere, settling on the cracked linoleum like ash. My fingers trace the jagged edge of the tooth human, yes, but not the teeth in the jar from the apartment. Those were smaller. Smoother, this one is sharp, ancient, the kind that leaves a metallic tang on the tongue. I taste copper and the damp wool of a forgotten scarf. The train whistle isn't a sound anymore. It's the pulse in my temples, the rhythm of my own blood slowing thump and thump. Thump, like a heart giving up. The mold dissolves, not crumbling, not burning, just fraying at the edges like thread pulled from a sweater. The shelves, the kiosks, the silent escalators, all melting into the same gray snow. It fills the space between my fingers, between my thoughts. I don't feel it. I only feel the weight of the tooth in my mouth, the way it presses against my gum, cold and unyielding. The cat lies still on the floor, its tiny body rigid. I can't look at it. I felt this before. The 5-minute lag. The cat's breath was the last sound before the snow swallowed it whole. Now silence, not deafening, just absent, like the space where a heartbeat should be. The snow covers the cat's eyes, not gently, not slowly. It just tifidisi there, layer after layer, freezing the glassy emptiness of its sockets shut. And as it settles, the snow changes. The gray and white blur, then sharpen. The snow becomes a single perfect tooth, small and white, pressed into the cat's closed eyes. I don't move. I can't. The tooth isn't just beyond the cat. It be. The cat's eyes now, the same shape, the same impossible cold. The train whistle echoes in my chest, thump thump. Thump-teen for the first time, I hear it clearly, not a whistle, but the sound of a key turning in a lock that was never meant to open. The tooth in my mouth feels heavier, sharper. I swallow. The cold bit deeper. The snow isn't falling anymore, it's turning. Into teeth, into the silence, into the shape of the thing that was waiting in the box, in the jar, in the teeth I chewed to make it real. The snow covers the cat's eyes, and the eyes become a tooth. The train whistle is my heartbeat. The cat's eyes are a tooth. The mole is gone. Only the snow, the tooth, and the sound of my own breath stopping.